Chapter 5. Disregarding the scratchy bushes, I dashed after the dog, who was scurrying through the sage brush with reckless speed. I soon lost sight of its golden fur shimmering amidst the fragrant wild shrubs, and followed the sound of its barks, growing fainter and fainter in the distance. Uneasily, I glanced at the thick fog advancing on me. It closed in around the spot where I stood, and within moments there was no sight of the sky. The late afternoon sun, like a subdued ball of fire, was scarcely discernible, and the magnificent view of the Santa Monica Bay, now more imagined than seen from the Santa Susana Mountains, had disappeared with incredible speed. I wasn't worried about the dog getting lost. I, however, had no idea where to find the secluded spot my friends had chosen for our picnic, or where the hiking path was that I had taken to chase after the dog. I took a few hesitant steps in the same general direction the dog had followed, when something made me stop. Emerging from above, through some crack in the fog, I saw a tiny point of light descending toward me. Another one followed, then another, like little flames tied to a string. The lights trembled and vibrated in the air. Then, just before they reached me, they vanished, as though the fog around me had swallowed them up. Since they had disappeared only a few feet in front of me, I moved on, closer to the spot, eager to examine that extraordinary sight. As I peered intently into the fog, I saw dark human shapes glide through the air, 2 or 3 feet off the ground, moving as though they were tiptoeing on clouds. One after the other, the human shapes squatted, forming a circle. I took a few more vacillating steps, then stopped as the fog thickened and absorbed them. I remained still, not knowing what to do. I felt a most unusual fright, not the fright I'm familiar with, but one in my body, in my belly, the kind of fright animals must have. I don't know how long I stood there. When the fog cleared enough for me to see, I saw to my left, about 50 feet away, 2 men sitting cross-legged on the ground. They were whispering to each other. The sound of their voices seemed to be all around me, captured in small patches of fog that were like tufts of cotton. I didn't understand what they were saying, but I felt reassured as I caught a word here and there. They were speaking in Spanish. "I'm lost!" I shouted in Spanish. Both men slowly turned around, hesitant, disbelieving, as though they were seeing an apparition. I spun around, wondering if there was someone behind me that was causing their dramatic reaction, but there was no one. Grinning, one of the men rose, stretched his limbs until his joints cracked, then covered the distance between us in quick strides. He was young, short, and powerfully built, with massive shoulders and a big head. His dark eyes radiated amusement and curiosity. I told him that I had been hiking with friends and had gotten lost, chasing after their dog. I've no idea how to get back to them, I finished. "You can't go any further this way," the man warned me. "We are standing on a cliff." He took me confidently by the arm and led me to the very edge of the precipice, no more than 10 feet away from where I had been standing. "This friend of mine," he said, pointing to the other man, who had remained seated, staring at me, had just finished telling me that there is an ancient Indian burial ground down below when he showed up and nearly scared us to death. He studied my face, my long blonde braid, and asked, "Are you Swedish?" Still bewildered by what the young man had said about the burial ground, I stared into the fog. Under normal circumstances, as a student of anthropology, I would have been thrilled to find out about an ancient Indian burial ground. At the moment, however, I couldn't care less if there was indeed one in that foggy emptiness below me. All I could think about was that if I hadn't been distracted by those lights, I might have ended up buried myself. "Are you Swedish?" the young man asked again. "I am." I lied, and immediately regretted it. I couldn't think of any way to correct it, though, without losing face. "You speak Spanish perfectly," the man commented. "Swedish people have a marvelous ear for languages." Although I felt terribly guilty, I couldn't help adding that more than a gift, it was a necessity for Scandinavians to learn various languages if they wanted to communicate with the rest of the world. Besides, I confessed, I grew up in South America. For some strange reason, this piece of information seemed to baffle the young man. He shook his head, as if in disbelief, and then remained silent for a long while, deep in thought. Then, as if he had arrived at some kind of a decision, he took me briskly by the hand and guided me to where the other man was sitting. I had no intention of socializing. I wanted to get back to my friends as soon as possible. But the young man made me feel so at ease that instead of asking them to lead me back to the hiking path, I gave them a detailed account of the lights and human shapes I had just seen. "How strange that the spirit would spare her," the seated man muttered, as if to himself, his dark brows drawn together in a frown. But obviously he was talking to his companion, who mumbled something in return that I didn't catch. They exchanged conspiratorial glances, intensifying my feelings of unease. "I beg your pardon?" I said, turning to the man who was sitting. "I didn't get what you were saying." He stared at me aggressively and morosely. "You were warned of the danger," he stated, in a voice that was deep and resonant. "The emissaries of death came to your help." "The who?" I felt compelled to ask, even though I had understood him perfectly well. I examined him closely. For an instant, I had the certainty I knew him. But as I kept staring at him, I realized I had never seen him before. Yet I couldn't completely discard the feeling of knowing him. He was not as young as the other man, but he wasn't old either. He was definitely an Indian. His skin was dark brown. His hair was blue-black, straight and thick as a brush. But it wasn't only his outward appearance that was almost familiar to me. He was morose, as only I could be morose. Seemingly uncomfortable under my scrutiny, he rose abruptly. "I'll take you to your friends," he mumbled. "Follow me, and don't you dare fall down. You'll fall on top of me and kill us both," he added in a gruff tone. Before I had the opportunity to say that I wasn't a clumsy oaf, he led the way down a very steep side of a mountain in the opposite direction of the cliff. "Do you know where you are going?" I shouted after him, my voice sharp with nervousness. I couldn't orient myself. Not that I am normally good at it, but I had not been aware of climbing up a hill as I chased the dog. The man turned around. An amused little grin quickly lit his face, though his eyes did not smile. He looked at me with a black, stony look. "I'm going to take you to your friends," was all he said. I didn't like him, yet I believed him. He wasn't too tall, about 5'10", and he was small-boned, yet his body projected the massiveness and compactness of a stocky person. He moved in the fog with extraordinary confidence, stepping with ease and grace down what I thought was a vertical drop. The younger man climbed down behind me, helping me every time I got stuck. He had the solicitous manner of an old-fashioned gentleman. His hands were strong and beautiful, and incredibly soft to the touch. His strength was tremendous. He easily lifted me up and over his head several times. Perhaps not an extraordinary feat considering my puny weight, but quite impressive, taking into account that he was standing on shale ledges and was no more than 2 or 3 inches taller than I. You have to thank the emissaries of death. The man who had led the way insisted as soon as we had reached level ground. "I do?" I asked mockingly. The thought of saying thank you to the emissaries of death seemed ridiculous to me. "Do I have to go down on my knees?" I asked in between a fit of giggles. The man didn't think I was being funny. He rested his hands on his hips and looked me full in the eye. His narrow, gaunt face unsmiling. There was something menacing about his stance, about his slanted dark eyes under the bristly eyebrows running together over the bridge of his chiseled nose. Abruptly, he turned his back to me and moved away to sit on a nearby rock. "We can't leave this spot until you thank the emissaries of death," he pronounced. Suddenly, the realization that I was alone in a godforsaken place hit me. I was fogged in with 2 strange men, one of them perhaps dangerous. I knew he wouldn't budge from the spot until I fulfilled his ludicrous request. To my amazement, instead of feeling frightened, I felt like laughing. The all-knowing smile on the younger man's face clearly revealed that he knew how I felt and was quite delighted by it. "You don't have to go as far as kneeling," he told me. And then, no longer able to hold back his mirth, he began to laugh. It was a bright, raspy sound. It rolled like pebbles all around me. His teeth were snow white and perfectly even, like a child's. His face had a look at once mischievous and gentle. "It's enough to say thank you," he prompted me. "Say it. What do you have to lose?" "I feel stupid," I confided, deliberately trying to win him over. "I won't do it." "Why?" he asked in a non-judgmental tone. "It'll only take a second. And," he stressed, smiling, "it won't hurt a bit." In spite of myself, I had to giggle. "I'm sorry, but I can't do it," I repeated. "I'm like that. The moment someone insists that I do something I don't want to do, I get all tense and angry." Eyes on the ground, his chin resting on his knuckles, the young man nodded his head thoughtfully. "It's a fact that something prevented you from getting hurt," perhaps even killed, he said after a long pause. Something inexplicable. I agreed with him. I even admitted that it was all very baffling to me. And I tried to make a point about phenomena happening coincidentally at the right time, in the right place. That's all very appropriate, he said. Then he grinned and daringly nudged me on the chin. But it doesn't explain your particular case, he said. You have been the recipient of a gift. Call the giver confident. Call the giver coincidence, circumstances, chain of events, or whatever. The fact remains that you were spared pain, injury. Perhaps you're right, I conceded. I should be more grateful. Not more grateful, more pliable, more fluid, he said, and laughed. Seeing that I was getting angry, he opened his arms wide, as if to encompass the sagebrush around us. My friend believes that what you saw has to do with the Indian burial ground, which happens to be right here. I don't see a burial ground, I said defensively. It's hard to recognize it, he explained, squinting at me as if he had trouble with his eyes. And it isn't the fog that prevents one from seeing it. Even on a sunny day, one sees nothing but a patch of sagebrush. He went down on his knees and, grinning, looked up at me. However, for the knowing eye, it's an unusually shaped patch of sagebrush. He lay flat on the ground, on his stomach, his head tilted to the left, and motioned me to do the same. This is the only way to see it clearly, he explained, as I lay down beside him on the ground. I wouldn't have known this, but for my friend here, who knows all kinds of interesting and exciting things. At first I saw nothing. Then, one by one, I discovered the rocks in the thick underbrush, dark and shiny, as though they had been washed by the mist. They sat hunched in a circle, more like creatures than stones. I stifled a scream as I realized that the circle of rocks was exactly like the circle of human figures I had seen earlier in the fog. Now I am truly frightened, I mumbled, shifting uncomfortably. I told you that I saw human figures sitting in a circle. I looked at him to see if his face betrayed any disapproval or mockery before I added, It's too preposterous, but I could almost swear those rocks were the people I saw. I know, he whispered, so softly I had to move closer to him. It's all very mysterious, he went on. My friend, who you must have noticed, is an Indian, says that certain Indian burial grounds, such as this one, have a row or a circle of boulders. The boulders are the emissaries of death. He looked at me closely and then, as if he wanted to make sure he had my full attention, confided. They are the emissaries, mind you, and not the representation of the emissaries. I kept staring at the man, not only because I didn't know what to make of his statements, but because his face kept changing as he talked and smiled. It wasn't that his features changed, but his face was at moments that of a 6-year-old child, a 17-year-old boy, and that of an old man too. These are strange beliefs, he continued, seemingly oblivious to my scrutiny. I didn't put too much stock in them until the moment you came out of the blue. As my friend was telling me about the emissaries of death, and then you told us that you had just seen them. If I were given to distrust, he went on, his tone suddenly menacing, I wouldn't believe that you and he are in cahoots. I would believe that you and he are in cahoots. I don't know him, I defended myself, indignant at the mere suggestion, then whispered softly so only he could hear. To be quite frank, your friend gives me the creeps. If I were given to distrust, the young man repeated, ignoring my interruption, I wouldn't believe that you two are actually trying to scare me. But I'm not distrustful. So, the only thing I can do is suspend judgment and wonder about you. Well, don't wonder about me, I said irritably. And I don't know what the hell you're talking about anyway. I glared at him angrily. I had no sympathy for his dilemma. He too was giving me the creeps. He's talking about thanking the emissaries of death, the older man said. He had walked to where I was lying and was peering down at me in a most peculiar manner. Eager to get away from that place and those two crazy people, I stood up and shouted my thanks. My voice echoed, as if the underbrush had turned into rocks. I listened until the sound died away. Then, as if possessed, and quite against my better judgment, I cried out my thanks again and again. I'm sure the emissaries are more than satisfied, the younger man said, nudging my calf. Laughing, he rolled on his back. There was a wonderful strength in his eyes, in the delighted power of his laugh. I didn't doubt for an instant, despite the levity, that indeed I had thanked the emissaries of death. And most oddly, I felt myself protected by them. Who are you two? I directed my question at the younger man. In one agile, smooth motion, he sprang to his feet. I'm Jose Luis Cortez. My friends call me Joe, he said, holding out his hand to clasp mine. And this here is my friend, Gumersindo Evans Pritchard. Afraid I would laugh out loud at the name, I bit my lip and bent to scratch an imaginary bite on my knee. A flea, I think, I said, gazing from one man to the other. Both stared back at me, defying me to make fun of the name. There was such a serious expression on their faces that my laughter vanished. Gumersindo Evans Pritchard reached out for my hand, hanging limply at my side, and shook it vigorously. I'm delighted to make your acquaintance, he said in perfect English with an upper-class British accent. For a moment, I thought you were one of those stuck-up cunts. Simultaneously, my eyes widened and my mouth opened. Although something in me registered that his words were meant as a compliment rather than an insult. My shock was nevertheless so intense that I just stood there, as if paralyzed. I wasn't prudish. Under the proper circumstances, I could outswear anyone. But to me, there was something so appealingly offensive about the sound of the word cunt, it rendered me speechless. Joe came to my rescue. He apologized for his friend, explaining that Gumersindo was an extreme social iconoclast. Before I had a chance to say that Gumersindo had definitely shattered my sense of propriety, Joe added that Gumersindo's compulsion to be an iconoclast had to do with the fact that his last name was Evans Pritchard. It shouldn't surprise anyone, Joe noted. His father is an Englishman who abandoned his mother, an Indian woman from Jalisco, before Gumersindo was born. Evans Pritchard, I repeated, guardedly, then turned to Gumersindo and asked him if it was all right for Joe to reveal to a stranger his family's skeletons in the closet. There aren't skeletons in the closet, Joe answered for his friend. And do you know why? He fixed me with his shiny, dark eyes that were neither brown nor black, but the color of ripe cherries. Helplessly, I shook my head to say no, my attention held by his compelling gaze. One eye seemed to be laughing at me. The other was dead serious, ominous, and menacing. Because what you call skeletons in the closet are Gumersindo's source of strength, Joe went on. Do you know that his father is now a famous English anthropologist? Gumersindo hates his guts. Gumersindo nodded his head, almost imperceptibly, as if he were proud of his hatred. I could hardly believe my good fortune. They were referring to none other than E.E. Evans Pritchard, one of the most important social anthropologists of the 20th century. And it was precisely during this term at UCLA that I was researching a paper on the history of social anthropology and the most eminent proponents in the field. What a scoop! I had to restrain myself from shouting out loud and jumping up and down with excitement. To be able to come with some awful secret like that. A great anthropologist seducing and abandoning an Indian woman. I was not in the least concerned that Evans Pritchard hadn't done any fieldwork in Mexico. He was mainly known for his research in Africa. For I was certain I would discover that during one of his visits to the United States, he had gone into Mexico. I had the very proof standing before me. Smiling sweetly, I gazed at Gumersindo and made the silent promise that, of course, I wouldn't reveal anything without his permission. Well, perhaps I would just say something to one of my professors, I thought. After all, one didn't come across this kind of information every day. My mind was spinning with possibilities. Perhaps a small lecture with only a few selected students at the home of one of my professors. In my mind, I had already selected the professor. I didn't particularly like him, but I appreciated the rather childish manner in which he tried to impress his students. Periodically, we met at his home. Every time I had been there, I had discovered on his desk a note. Left there as if by mistake, written to him by a famous anthropologist, Claude Levi-Strauss. You didn't tell us your name, Joe said politely, gently pulling me by the sleeve. Carmen Gabar, I said without hesitation, giving the name of one of my childhood friends. To ease my discomfort and guilt at having lied again with such facility, I asked Joe if he was from Argentina. Seeing his puzzled frown, I hastened to add and his inflection was definitely Argentinian, even though you don't look like an Argentinian, I noted. I'm Mexican, he said. And, judging by your accent, you grew up either in Cuba or in Venezuela. I didn't want to continue on that line of conversation and swiftly changed the subject. Do you know how to get back to the hiking path? I asked, suddenly concerned that my friends might be worried by now. No, I don't, Joe confessed, with childish condor. But Gumersindo Evans Pritchard does. Gumersindo led the way across the chaparral, up a narrow trail on the other side of the mountain. It wasn't long before we heard my friends' voices and the barking of their dog. I felt intense relief, and at the same time I was disappointed and puzzled that neither man tried to find out how to get in touch with me. I'm sure we'll meet again, Joe said perfunctorily by way of farewell. Gumersindo Evans Pritchard surprised me by gallantly kissing my hand. He did this so naturally and gracefully that it didn't occur to me to laugh at him. It's in his genes, Joe explained. Even though he's only half English, his refinement is beyond reproach. He's totally gallant. Without another word or backward glance, both of them disappeared in the mist. I doubted very much that I would ever see them again. Overcome with guilt for having lied about my name, I was on the verge of running after them when my friend's dog almost knocked me to the ground as it jumped on me and tried to lick my face. Chapter 6. Dumbfounded, I stared at the guest speaker. In his three-piece suit, short, curly hair, and clean-shaven face, Joe Cortez looked like someone from another time amidst the long-haired, bearded, and beaded, casually dressed students in one of the large lecture auditoriums at the University of California in Los Angeles. Hastily, I slipped into the empty seat in the back row of the packed-out auditorium, a seat saved for me by the same friend I had gone hiking with in the Santa Susana Mountains. Who is he? I asked her. Shaking her head in disbelief, she regarded me impatiently, then scribbled Carlos Castaneda on a piece of paper. Who in the dickens is Carlos Castaneda? I asked, and giggled involuntarily. I gave you his book, she hissed, then added that he was a well-known anthropologist who had done extensive fieldwork in Mexico. I was about to confide to my friend that the guest speaker was the same man I had met in the mountains the day I had gotten lost. However, for some very good reason, I didn't say anything. That man was responsible for almost destroying our friendship, which I treasured immensely. My friend had been adamant in her opinion that the story about Evan Pritchard's son was hogwash. I had insisted that the two men had nothing to gain by telling me a tall tale. I just knew that they had candidly spoken the truth. My friend, mad at me for believing them, had called me a gullible fool. Since neither of us had been willing to yield, our argument had become quite heated. Her husband, hoping to bring us out of our frenzy, had suggested that perhaps I had been told the truth. Irked by his lack of solidarity with her, my friend had yelled at him to shut up. We had driven home in a morose state. our friendship strained. It took a couple of weeks to wash away the bad feeling. In the meantime, I had tried my information on Evan Pritchard's son on several people more versed in anthropological matters and in anthropologists than I or my friend. Needless to say, I was made to feel like an idiot. Out of stubbornness, I held on to my blind belief that I alone knew the truth. I had been reared to be practical. If one lies, it has to be to gain something that can't be gained otherwise. And I was at a loss to figure out what those men could have had to gain. I paid little attention to Carlos Castaneda's lecture. I was too absorbed with wondering about his reason for lying to me about his name. Given as I was to deducing other people's motives from a simple statement or an observation, I had a field day trying to search for a clue to his. But then I remembered that I too had given him a false name, and I couldn't determine why I had done so. After long mental deliberation, I decided that I had lied because automatically I hadn't trusted him. He was too self-confident, too cocky to inspire my trust. My mother had reared me to distrust Latin men, especially if they were not somewhat subservient. She used to say that Latin machos were like bantam cocks, interested only in fighting, eating, and having sex, in that order. And I suppose I had believed her without even thinking about it. I finally looked at Carlos Castaneda. I couldn't make heads or tails of what he was talking about, but I became fascinated by his movements. He seemed to speak with his whole body, and his words, rather than emerging from his mouth, seemed to flow from his hands, which he moved with the gracefulness and agility of a magician. Boldly, I walked up to him after the lecture. He was surrounded by students. He was so solicitous and engaging with the women that I automatically despised him. "You've lied to me about your name, Joe Cortez," I said in Spanish, pointing an accusing finger at him. Holding his hand over his stomach, as if he had received a blow, he gazed at me with that same hesitant, disbelieving expression he had had when he first saw me in the mountains. "It is also a lie that your friend Gumersindo is the son of Evan Pritchard," I added before he recovered from his surprise at seeing me. "Isn't it?" He made a pleading gesture for me to not say any more. He didn't seem to be in the least embarrassed, but there was such plain and simple wonder in his eyes that my righteous wrath was stopped short. Gently, he held me by the wrist, as if afraid I would leave. After he finished talking with the students, he silently led me to a secluded bench, shaded by a gigantic pine tree in the North Campus. "All this is so strange that I am truthfully speechless," he said in English as we sat down. He gazed at me as if he still couldn't believe I was sitting beside him. "I never thought I would find you again," he mused. "After we left, my friend, his name, by the way, is Nestor, and I discussed you at great length. We concluded that you were a semi-apparition. He abruptly changed to Spanish and said that they even went back to the place where they had left me in the hope of finding me. "Why did you want to find me?" I asked in English, confident that he would respond in English that he went there because he liked me. In Spanish, there is no way to say that one just liked someone else. The response has to be more florid and at the same time more precise. In Spanish, one can either happen to evoke a good feeling, me caes bien, or arouse total passion, me gustas. My candid question plunged him into a long silence. He seemed to be fighting whether he ought to speak or not. At last, he said that finding me in the fog that afternoon had caused him a profound upheaval. His face was enraptured as he revealed all this, and his voice betrayed the deepest awe as he added that finding me in the lecture room had been nearly the end of him. "Why?" I asked, my vanity pricked. And I instantly regretted it because I was convinced he was going to tell me he was head over heels in love with me. And that would have been too disturbing. I wouldn't have known how to respond. "It's a very long story," he said, still in a pensive mood. He puckered his lips as if he were talking to himself, rehearsing what he was going to say next. I knew the signs of a man who was preparing to make his pitch. "I haven't read your work," I said, in order to head him off in a different direction. "What is it about?" "I've written a couple books about sorcery," he replied. "What kind of sorcery? Voodoo, spiritualism, or what?" "Do you know anything about sorcery?" he asked, with a note of expectation in his voice. "Of course I do. I grew up with it. I spent a great deal of time in the coastal region of Venezuela. It's an area that is famous for its sorcerers. Most summers of my childhood were spent with a family of witches." "Witches?" "Yes," I said, pleased with his reaction. "I had a nanny who was a witch. She was a black woman from Puerto Cabello. She took care of me until I was an adolescent. Both my parents worked, and when I was a child, they were quite happy to leave me in her care. She could handle me much better than either of my parents. She would let me do as I pleased. My parents, of course, let her take me everywhere. During the school holidays, she would take me with her to visit her family. It was not her biological family, but her witch family. Although I wasn't allowed to participate in any of their rituals and trance sessions, I did manage to see a great deal." He regarded me curiously, as if he didn't believe me. Then he asked, with a bemused smile, "What made her a witch?" "All sorts of things. She killed chickens and offered them to the gods in exchange for favors. She and her fellow witches, men and women, would dance until they would go into a trance. She recited secret incantations that had the power to heal her friends and injure her enemies. Her specialty was love potions. She prepared them with medicinal plants and all sorts of bodily refuse, such as menstrual blood, nail clippings, and hair, preferably pubic hair. She made amulets for good luck in gambling or in matters of love." "And your parents allowed all this?" he asked, in disbelief. At home, no one knew about it, except myself and my nanny's clients, of course, I explained. She made house calls, as any doctor would. All she ever did at home was to burn candles behind the toilet bowl whenever I had nightmares. Since it seemed to help me, and there was no danger of anything catching fire amidst the tiles, my mother openly allowed her to do this. He suddenly stood up and began to laugh. "What's so funny?" I asked, wondering whether he thought I had made it all up. "It's the truth, I assure you." "You assert something to yourself, and, as far as you are concerned, once you make the assertion, it turns into the truth," he said with a serious face. "But I told you the truth," I insisted, certain that he was referring to my nanny. "I can see through people," he said calmly. "For instance, I see you're convinced that I'm going to make a pass at you. You convinced yourself about it, and now it is the truth. That's what I'm talking about." I tried to say something, but indignation took my breath away. I would have liked to run away, but that would have been too humiliating. He frowned slightly, and I had the unpleasant impression that he knew what I was feeling. My face got red. I trembled with suppressed anger. Nonetheless, within moments, I felt extraordinarily calm. It wasn't due to any conscious effort on my part, yet I had the distinct sensation that something in me had shifted. I had the vague recollection that I had gone through a similar experience before, but my memory faded away as fast as it came. "What are you doing to me?" I muttered. "I just happen to see through people," he said in a contrite tone. "Not all the time, and certainly not with everybody, but only with the people I am intimately associated with. I don't know why I can see through you." His sincerity was apparent. He seemed much more baffled than I was. He sat down again and moved closer to me on the bench. We remained in total silence for a while. It was a most pleasant experience to be able to drop all effort at making conversation and not feel that I was being stupid. I looked up at the sky. It was cloudless and transparent, like blue glass. A soft breeze blew through the pine branches, and the needles fell on us like a gentle rain. Then the breeze turned into a wind, and the dry, yellow fallen leaves of the nearby sycamore blew toward us. They swirled around us with a soft, rhythmic sound. In one abrupt swoop, the wind carried the leaves high up into the air. "That was a fine display of the spirit," he murmured. "And it wasn't for you. The wind, the leaves spinning in the air in front of us. The sorcerer I work with would say that that was an omen. Something pointed you out to me at the precise moment I was thinking that I'd better leave. I cannot leave now." Thinking only about his last statement, I felt inexplicably happy. It wasn't a triumphant happiness, the kind of glee one feels when one is getting one's way. It was rather a feeling of profound well-being that didn't last long. My ponderous self took over suddenly and demanded that I be rid of those thoughts and feelings. I had no business being there. I had cut a class, missed lunch with my real friends, Missed my daily laps at the pool in the women's gym. Perhaps it'll be better if I leave, I said. I intended it as a statement of relief, but when I said it, it sounded as if I were feeling sorry for myself, which somehow I was. But instead of leaving, I asked him, as casually as I could, whether he had always been able to see through people. No, not always. His kind tone clearly betrayed that he was conscious of my inner turmoil. The old sorcerer I work with has recently taught me how. Do you think that he could teach me too? Yes, I think he would. He seemed amazed at his own statement. If he feels about you the way I do, he'll certainly try to. Did you know about sorcery before? I asked, timidly, slowly coming out of my agitation. In Latin America, everybody thinks that they know, and I believed I did. In that sense, you remind me of myself. Like you, I was convinced that I knew what sorcery was. But then, when I really encountered it, it wasn't like I thought it was. How was it? Simple. So simple that it's scary, he confided. We think that sorcery is scary because of its malignancy. The sorcery I encountered is not malignant at all. And because of that, it's the scariest thing there is. I interrupted him and commented that he must be referring to white as opposed to black sorcery. Don't talk nonsense, damn it, he impatiently snapped at me. The shock of hearing him speak to me in that manner was so great that I gasped for breath. I was instantly thrown back into turmoil. He turned his face to avoid my gaze. He had dared to yell at me. I became so angry I thought he was going to have a fit. My ears were buzzing. I saw dark spots in front of my eyes. I would have hit him if he hadn't jumped out of my reach so swiftly. You're very undisciplined, he said, and sat down again, and quite violent. Your nanny must have indulged your every whim and treated you as if you were made of precious glass. Seeing my scowling frown, he went on to say that he hadn't really yelled at me out of impatience or anger. It doesn't matter to me personally whether you listen or not, he explained. But it matters to someone else on whose behalf I shouted at you. Someone who is watching us. I was perplexed at first, then uneasy. I looked all around me, wondering whether his sorcerer teacher might be watching us. He ignored me and went on to say, my father never mentioned to me that we have a constant witness. He never mentioned it because he didn't know it, just like you yourself don't know it. What kind of nonsense are you talking about? My raspy, angry voice reflected my feelings at the moment. He had yelled at me. He had insulted me. I resented that he was talking his head off, as if nothing had happened. If he believed that I was going to overlook his actions, he was in for a surprise. You won't get away with it, I thought, smiling at him maliciously. Not with me, buddy. I'm talking about a force, an entity, a presence, which is neither a force nor an entity, nor a presence. He explained with an angelic smile. He seemed totally oblivious to my belligerent mood. Sounds like gibberish, but it isn't. I am referring to something that only sorcerers know about. They call it the spirit, our personal watcher, our perennial witness. I don't know exactly how or what precise word triggered it, but suddenly he had my full attention. He went on talking about this force, which he said wasn't God or anything to do with religion or morality, but an impersonal force, a power that was there for us to use if we only learned to reduce ourselves to nothing. He even held my hand, and I didn't mind it. In fact, I liked the feel of his strong, soft touch. I became morbidly fascinated with the strange power he had over me. I was aghast that I longed to sit with him on that bench indefinitely, with my hand in his. He went on talking, and I went on listening to every word he said. But at the same time, I perversely wondered when he was going to grab my leg. For I knew that he wasn't going to have enough with my hand, and I couldn't do anything to stop him. Or was it that I didn't want to do anything to stop him? He explained that he had been as careless and undisciplined as one could be, but that he never knew the difference, because he was imprisoned by the mood of the time. What's the mood of the time? I asked in a rough, unfriendly voice, lest he think I was enjoying being with him. Sorcerers call it the modality of the time, he said. In our day, it's the concern of the middle class. I am a middle class man, just like you're a middle class woman. Classifications of that nature don't hold any validity. I interrupted him rudely, yanking my hand out of his. They are simply generalizations. I scowled at him suspiciously. There was something startlingly familiar about his words, but I couldn't think where I had heard them before, or what significance I was attaching to them. Yet I was sure they had a very vital significance for me if I could only recall what I already knew about them. Don't give me this social scientist gaffe, he said jovially. I'm as aware of it as you are. Giving in to a wave of total frustration, I took his hand and bit it. I'm truly sorry about that, I instantly mumbled, before he recovered from his surprise. I don't know why I did it. I haven't bitten anyone since I was a child. I sidled to the far edge of the bench in readiness for his retaliation. It didn't come. You're absolutely primitive, was all he said, rubbing his hand in a dazed sort of way. I let out a deep sigh of relief. His power over me was shattered, and I remembered that I had an old score to settle with him. He had turned me into the laughingstock of my anthropology student friends. Let's go back to our original problem, I said, trying to arouse my anger. Why did you tell me all that nonsense about Evans Pritchard's son? You must have realized that I was going to make a fool of myself. I watched him carefully, certain that confronting him like this after the bite would finally break his self-control, or at least rattle him. I expected him to yell, to lose his confidence and impudence. But he remained unperturbed. He took a deep breath and adopted a serious expression. I know that it looks like a simple case of people telling tall tales for their amusement, he began in a light, casual tone. But it's more complex than that. He chuckled softly, then reminded me that he hadn't known at that time that I was a student of anthropology and that I would make a fool of myself. He paused for a moment, as if searching for the proper words. Then he shrugged helplessly and added, I really can't explain to you now why I introduced my friend to you as Evans Pritchard's son, unless I tell you much more about myself and my aims, and that's not practical. Why not? Because the more you know about me, the more entangled you'll become. He regarded me thoughtfully, and I could see in his eyes that he was sincere. And I don't mean a mental entanglement. I mean you'll become personally entangled with me. This was such a blatant display of gall that I regained all my confidence. I fell back on my well-tried, sarcastic laughter and said in a cutting tone, You are perfectly disgusting. I know your kind. You are the typical example of the conceited Latin macho I have battled with all my life. Seeing the expression of surprise on his face, I pressed on in a most haughty tone. How dare you to think that I'll be entangled with you? He didn't become red in the face, as I expected. He slapped his knee and laughed uproariously, as if that was the funniest thing he had ever heard. And to my utter dismay, he began to tickle me in the ribs, as if I were a child. Afraid to laugh, I was ticklish. I screeched with indignation. How dare you to touch me? I stood up to leave. I was shaking, and then I shocked myself even further by sitting down again. Seeing that he was about to tickle me again, I curled my hands into fists and held them before me. I'll smash your nose if you touch me again, I warned him. Thoroughly unconcerned by my threat, he reclined his head against the back of the bench and closed his eyes. He laughed gaily, a deep, chortling laugh that made him shiver all over. You're a typical German girl who grew up surrounded by brown people, he said, turning sideways toward me. How do you know that I am German? I never told you that. I said in a faltering voice I intended to be softly menacing. I knew that you were German when I first met you, he said. You confirmed it the moment you lied that you were Swedish. Only Germans born in the New World after the Second World War lie like that. That is, of course, if they live in the United States. Although I wasn't going to admit this to him, he was right. I had often felt people's hostility as soon as they learned that my parents were Germans. In their eyes, it automatically made us Nazis. It didn't make any difference when I told them that my parents were idealists. Of course, I had to admit to myself that, like good Germans, they believed that their kind were inherently better. But basically, they were gentle souls who had been apolitical all their lives. All I did was to agree with you, I pointed out acidly. You saw blonde hair, blue eyes, high cheekbones, and all you could think of was a Swede. You're not very imaginative, are you? I pushed my advantage. You had no business lying yourself, unless you're a fucking liar by nature. I went on, my voice rising against my will. Tapping his chest with my index finger, I added, derisively, Joe Cortez, huh? Is your name really Christina Gabar? He shot back, imitating my odious, loud voice. Carmen Gabar? I shouted, offended that he hadn't remembered the name correctly. Then, suddenly ashamed of my outburst, I went into a chaotic defense of myself. After a few moments, realizing that I didn't know what I was saying, I abruptly stopped and confessed that I was indeed German and that Carmen Gabar was the name of a childhood friend. I like that, he said softly, a barely suppressed grin on his lips. Whether he was referring to my lying or to my confession, I couldn't tell. His eyes were brimming with kindness and with amusement. In a tender, wistful voice, he proceeded to tell me the story of his childhood friend, Fabiola Kunz. Confused by his reaction, I turned away and gazed at the nearby sycamore and the pine trees beyond. Then, eager to hide my interest in his story, I began to play with my fingernails. I pushed back the cuticles and peeled off the nail polish, methodically and thoughtfully. The story of Fabiola Kunz resembled my own life so closely that after a few moments, I forgot all about my pretense at indifference and listened to him attentively. I suspected that he was fabricating the story, and yet I had to give him credit for coming up with details that only a daughter of a German family in the New World would know. Fabiola allegedly was mortally afraid of dark Latin boys, but she was equally afraid of the Germans. The Latins scared her because of their irresponsibility, the Germans because they were so predictable. I had to restrain myself from laughing out loud when he described scenes of Fabiola's home on a Sunday afternoon, when 24 Germans would sit around a beautifully set table with the best china, silver, and crystal, and she would have to listen to 24 monologues that passed for conversation. As he went on giving specific details of those Sunday afternoons, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable. There was Fabiola's father prohibiting political debates in his house, but compulsively aiming at starting one, seeking devious ways to tell dirty jokes about Catholic priests. Or her mother's mortal dread. Her fine china was in the hands of these clumsy oafs. His words were cues to which I unconsciously responded. I began to see scenes of my Sunday afternoons, like pictures flashed on the wall for my observation. I was a veritable bundle of nerves. I wanted to stomp and carry on, as only I knew how. I wanted to hate this man, but I couldn't. I wanted vindication, apologies, but I couldn't get anything from him. I wanted to dominate him. I wanted him to fall in love with me so I could reject him. Ashamed of my immature feelings, I made a great effort to pull myself together. Pretending to be bored, I leaned toward him and asked, "Why did you lie about your name?" "I didn't lie," he pronounced. That's my name. I have several names. Sorcerers have different names for different occasions. How convenient, I exclaimed sarcastically. Very convenient, he echoed, and gave a slight wink, which infuriated me beyond measure. And then he did something completely outlandish and unexpected. He put his arms around me. There was no sexual overtone in his embrace. It was the spontaneous, sweet, and simple gesture of a child who wants to comfort a friend. His touch soothed me instantly, and so completely that I began to sob uncontrollably. I'm such a shit, I confessed. I want to beat you, and look at me. I am in your arms. I was about to add that I was enjoying it when a surge of energy rushed through me. As if I had awakened from a dream, I pushed him away. Let go of me, I hissed, and stomped away. I heard him choking with laughter. I wasn't in the least concerned about his chuckles. My outburst had dissipated instantly. I stood rooted to the spot, trembling all over, unable to walk away. And then, as if I had a giant rubber band attached to me, I returned to the bench. Don't feel bad, he said kindly. He seemed to know exactly what it was that was pulling me back to the bench. He patted my back as one does a baby's after a meal. It isn't what you or I do, he continued. It's something outside the two of us which is acting upon us. It's been acting upon me for a long time. Now I'm accustomed to it, but I can't understand why it acts upon you. Don't ask me what it is, he said, anticipating my question. I can't yet explain it to you. I wasn't going to ask him anything anyway. My mind had stopped functioning. I felt exactly as if I were asleep, dreaming that I was talking. Moments later, my numbness passed. I felt more animated, yet not quite like my usual self. What's happening to me? I asked. You are being focused and pushed by something that doesn't stem from you, he said. Something is pushing you, using me as a tool. Something is superimposing another criterion on your middle-class convictions. Don't start on that middle-class idiocy, I said feebly. It was more like I was pleading with him. I smiled helplessly, thinking that I had lost my usual gall. These, by the way, are not my own opinions or ideas, he said. I'm like you, strictly a product of middle-class ideology. Imagine my horror when I came face to face with a different and a more prevailing ideology. It ripped me apart. What ideology is that? I asked meekly, my voice so low it was barely audible. A man brought that ideology to me, he explained. Or rather, the Spirit spoke and acted on me through him. That man is a sorcerer. I've written about him. His name is Juan Matus. He's the one who made me face my middle-class mentality. Juan Matus once asked me a grand question. What do you think a university is? I, of course, answered him like a social scientist. A center of higher learning. He corrected me and declared that a university should be called a middle-class institute, because it is the institution we attend to further perfect our middle-class values. We attend the institute to become professionists, he said. The ideology of our social class tells us that we must prepare ourselves for occupying managerial positions. Juan Matus said that men go to the Middle Class Institute to become engineers, lawyers, doctors, etc. And women go there to get a suitable husband, provider, and father of their children. Suitable is naturally defined by middle-class values. I wanted to contradict him. I wanted to shout at him that I knew people who weren't necessarily interested in a career or looking for a spouse. That I knew people who were interested in ideas, in learning for its own sake. But I didn't know such people. I felt a terrible pressure in my chest and had an attack of dry coughing. It wasn't the cough or the physical discomfort that made me wriggle in my seat and prevented me from arguing with him. It was the certainty that he was speaking about me. I was going to a university precisely to find a suitable man. Again, I stood up, ready to leave. I had even extended my hand to shake his in farewell, when I felt a powerful tug on my back. It was so strong I had to sit down, lest I fall. I knew he hadn't touched me. I had been looking at him all the time. Thoughts of people I didn't quite remember, of dreams I hadn't quite forgotten, came crowding into my mind, forming an intricate pattern from which I couldn't extricate myself. Unknown faces, half-heard sentences, dark images of places, and blurred images of people threw me momentarily into some kind of limbo. I was close to remembering something about all this kaleidoscope of visualizations and sounds. But the knowledge flittered away, and a feeling of calm and ease overtook me. A tranquility so deep that it screened out all my desire to assert myself. I stretched my legs in front of me, as if I didn't have a care in the world. And at that moment I didn't, and began to talk. I couldn't remember ever talking about myself so frankly before. And I couldn't fathom why I was suddenly so unguarded with him. I told him about Venezuela, my parents, my childhood, my restlessness, my meaningless life. I told him of things I wouldn't even admit to myself. I've been studying anthropology since last year, and I really don't know why, I said. I was beginning to feel slightly uncomfortable by my own revelations. I shifted restlessly on the bench, but I couldn't stop myself from adding. Two subjects that interest me more are Spanish and German literature. To be in the anthropology department defies all I know about myself. That detail intrigues me to no end, he said. I can't get into it now, but it seems as if I had been placed here for you to find me, or vice versa. What does all this mean? I asked, then blushed, realizing that I was interpreting and centering everything on my womanhood. He seemed to be thoroughly aware of my state of mind. He reached for my hand and pressed it against his heart. Me gustas, Nebelunga, Nebelunga, he exclaimed dramatically, and for good measure he translated the words into English. I'm passionately attracted to you, Nebelung. He looked at me with the eyes of a Latin lover, and then burst into raucous laughter. You're convinced I have to say this to you sooner or later, so it might as well be now. Instead of getting angry at being teased, I laughed. His humor gave me great pleasure. The only Nibelungen I knew were from my father's German mythology books, Siegfried and the Nibelungen. As far as I could remember, they were underground, magical dwarfish beings. Are you calling me a dwarf? I asked in jest. God forbid, he protested. I'm calling you a German mythical being. Shortly afterwards, as if it were the only thing we could have done, we drove to the Santa Susana Mountains, to the place we had met. Neither of us said a single word as we sat on the cliff overlooking the Indian burial ground. Moved by a pure impulse of companionship, we sat there in silence, oblivious to the afternoon turning into night.